It's been nearly 5 years since I moved away from that town. 5 years of drowning in alcohol. 5 years of waking up at night in a cold sweat, wondering if it had found me again. Every year since that night, I've dreaded October and that nightmarish holiday. While most people spend the month decorating their homes, I spend it barricading, reinforcing the doors and windows to make sure nothing steps foot inside. Growing up, Halloween was one of those special days. To me, it always felt like more than just a simple holiday. Every year, my friends and I would get together and show off our impressive costumes to one another. Then, we'd spend the evening wandering throughout the neighborhoods and gathering as much candy as we possibly could. It was such a simple activity, and perhaps that's why we enjoyed it so much. As the years passed, I inevitably hung up my candy bucket and began focusing more on school. Still, year after year, I'd see trick-or-treaters running around on Halloween in various costumes, in the hopes of collecting their own haul of candy. After high school, I had gotten a decent paying job and moved out of my parents' house into an apartment. Since then, I had bounced around from apartment to apartment, trying to save up enough money to purchase a house of my own. This went on for about 3 years before I finally found a place I could afford. The house I purchased was in the suburbs of a town not too far from the city I grew up in. It wasn't a large house, but it was serviceable. I settled in and my life continued smoothly until October eventually rolled around. During my time living in apartments, I wasn't truly able to embrace the spooky holiday. Decorating my apartment seemed like a wasted effort, and while I did have some candy on hand, I was never greeted by any trick-or-treaters. Looking back on it, those were the last peaceful years of my life. My first year actually living in a house brought forth the excitement and anticipation of Halloween. I was looking forward to decorating my entire house from top to bottom and handing out candy to all the trick-or-treaters. So that's precisely what I did. At the beginning of the month, I went to the store and bought decorations. A lot of decorations. Probably more than I should have. I spent days getting everything set up, and about a week prior to Halloween, I finished. When the day arrived, I lounged next to my front door and watched a bit of TV with a massive bowl of candy next to me. The hours drifted by, and it wasn't long until the knocks began to rattle lightly on my door. All manner of costumed characters eagerly held their candy bags aloft, and I smiled, dropping handfuls of candy into them. This went on for the first 2 hours or so. I'd soon finish with one round of trick-or-treaters only to be bombarded again a few minutes later. Despite having to get up and answer the door numerous times, I was still having a great time. Not long after the first 2 hours did the sun start to set. The already frigid weather outside became even more intense. This did little to deter the resolve of the trick-or-treaters, however. Once the sun had finally set, the intervals between trick-or-treaters became longer and longer. I went from getting up every few minutes to every 10 minutes, then 20. I began to lose track of time as I mindlessly watched a horror movie marathon on TV, eating some of the spare candy I had left over. Then, a subtle knock on my door drew my attention. I turned down the TV and glanced at the clock. It was nearing 9:30 at night. I thought that it seemed a little late for trick-or-treaters to still be out, but some stragglers aren't unusual, I suppose. I stood up with a candy bowl in hand and walked over to the door. I pulled open the door, expecting some eager trick-or-treaters to be waiting, but no one was there. I stepped out onto my porch and glanced around. There were a few costume figures down the street, still wandering around, but they were too far to be the ones who had knocked on my door. I thought perhaps that the movie I'd been watching tricked my brain into thinking someone knocked on my door. I turned around, stepped back inside, and shut the door tightly behind me. As soon as I was about to sit back down in my chair, another few taps sounded. My uneasiness quickly turned to annoyance as I realized I was probably dealing with a prankster. Someone ding-dong ditching me without the doorbell, that is. I got up with a huff and threw the door open, ready to confront the culprit. Nobody was there. I eyed the surroundings carefully before slowly shutting the door. When I shut it that time, I stood with my eye pressed to the eye hole. I waited for a few seconds, trying to catch whoever it was playing this prank. A minute passed, and nothing happened. Then, out of the edge of my porch light, I saw something come slinking into view. At first, I thought it was just another trick-or-treater. They were hunched over, walking low to the ground, with a dark outfit that blended in with the lightless backdrop. It stepped into the light and onto my porch, before stopping in front of my door. I thought to myself this would be my chance, that I'd be able to catch this punk red-handed. But then something odd happened. The person on the other side of the door didn't knock. They just stood there. I could only barely see the top of the hood that covered the head from how low they were, but I knew they were still there. A minute passed, followed by another. I was sure they would knock at any moment, though now I was beginning to dread it. Then I heard something coming from the other side of the door, a dissonant whisper that seemed to pass through the wooden door effortlessly. All it said was, "Trick or treat." And as the words hit my ear, a chill drifted down my shoulders. I slowly backed away from the door a few feet, unsure of what to make of the situation. While I was lost in a state of confusion, I realized something vital in that instant. I had been preparing to open the door to scold the prankster. The door was unlocked. The knob twisted, and before I could lunge for the lock, the door creaked open. The light from my porch poured into my darkened living room, nearly blinding me for a moment. That figure stepped into the doorframe like a living shadow. As it crossed into the threshold of my house, my breath became shallow. It lifted its head to look at me, and my heart thudded faster and faster. At first glance, it looked like a simple, albeit unsettling mask. It resembled the skull of a goat, or maybe a deer. Two bloodshot eyes stared at me from the sockets of this goat skull, but they weren't eyes hidden underneath a mask. They were a part of it. The eyes moved, twitched, and focused on me, all while resting in this skull. It then began to stand up from its previously hunched position. Its body seemed to stretch and elongate upwards endlessly, as its head nearly reached my ceiling. It tilted its head to the side, and the animal-like jaw of the mask began to unhinge. It was at that moment that I finally accepted that it wasn't a mask at all. It then held out a fur-covered hand towards me, which grasped what appeared to be a candy bag. "Trick," it hissed at me. It reached in and pulled out what appeared to be a piece of wet cloth, but after staring at it for a moment, I realized I was mistaken. My throat started to tighten as it placed it back into its bag, and whispered once more before pulling out a new one. Faces. It was pulling out faces from its bag. It took another step towards me, and I found myself rooted in place. My whole body trembled involuntarily as I watched this thing approach. With each step, a new face, another uttered trick. It was now only inches away from me. It towered over me like some hulking behemoth. It clutched my face with its free hand, nearly raising me off the ground. Those horrible bloodshot eyes stared deeply into mine, and despite its skull-like appearance, I could have sworn it was smiling. The claw on its index finger, which held my face, began to trace along my temple. As it did this, the word treat left its mouth in elation. White-hot pain shot throughout my body from my head to my toes. It slowly raked its sharp claw down the side of my face. In that instant, my mind went blank, and I brought both of my feet up to the creature's chest and I kicked as hard as I could. As my legs strained, I could feel its grip beginning to loosen. Even with just one hand, this thing was almost strong enough to hold on. I twisted and peeled my face away, summoning as much strength as I could muster. In an instant, I collided with the floor. The air shot out from my lungs and I felt disoriented. Still, somehow I managed to stagger to my feet and sprinted for the back door. I sold my house the following month. I have since moved into a small apartment in the inner city and have started drinking to pass the time. With yet another Halloween approaching, I hope you take this as a word of caution and stay safe out there. There will be a lot of costumes running around, and maybe some that aren't. As for me, I'll be spending another Halloween alone, sitting in front of my boarded-up door with a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a shotgun in the other.